Guten Tag, ich heiße Kenneth Oppel. I am delighted to have this chance to say hello from Canada during this year's Frankfurt Book Fair and get this opportunity to introduce you to the world of my latest book, Bloom. Let me tell you a little bit about how I came up with the idea for Bloom. It started from a couple of places. The first was a simple sentence that had been banging around in my head for quite a while. The sentence went like this: there was a dead patch in the garden where nothing grew. And I like that sentence a lot. I wrote it down in one of my many ideas notebooks where I write down so many of my ideas and brainstorm and doodle and daydream. What I liked about the sentence was this: it made my mind go in a whole bunch of different places. First of all, I thought, well, why doesn't anything grow there? What's going on with the soil? Is it toxic? Is there something underneath buried there that's poisoning the ground? Is there a supernatural curse on the soil? Why won't anything grow there? And then another question popped into my head. What if something one day did start to grow in this dead patch where nothing grew? What would it mean? What would it be? Why is it allowed to grow there when nothing else could? So I had that sentence in my ideas notebook, and it really didn't do anything for a couple of years. I liked it. I wanted to use it, but I didn't know how. And then my daughter had a very interesting nightmare that she was kind enough to share with me. And when she told me this nightmare, right away I thought, that is an amazing starting point for a story. And maybe not even just one story. Maybe it's 3 stories, 3 separate books. And the dream was this. My daughter was walking outside and it started to rain quite heavily. And then she looked down at her feet and realized they weren't raindrops. They were little tiny eggs. And as she kept walking, the eggs started to hatch, releasing these terrible, creepy, crawly things. And she started running for a bridge, thinking she would take cover under this bridge. She reaches the bridge, she goes underneath, and there's a man there taking shelter as well, but he's getting eaten alive by something that's hatched out of the biggest egg of all. And I thought, that is a very good dream. And I wanted it. So I took it. And that became, combined with that sentence in my head about the dead patch in the garden where nothing grew. And it ended up forming the 3 novels in my Bloom trilogy: Bloom, Hatch, and Thrive. The first book in the series, Bloom, involves an invasion of these strange black plants. It starts on Salt Spring Island, off the coast of British Columbia, and it spreads worldwide. No one knows where these plants have come from. They don't know how to get rid of them. A herbicide has no effect on them. You burn the grass, it produces a toxic smoke that sears people's lungs. You cut it down and it comes back the next day. It grows incredibly quickly, and it's crowding out crops, and there's worries that there's going to be a global food shortage. The first plant to appear on the planet is a black grass. It roots very quickly, grows very swiftly. It's a bit like bamboo. It's thick, it's very spiky. The thing about a black plant is it can photosynthesize any wavelength of light. It doesn't need to be green to get its energy, so it's a very useful skill. So when the black grass grows to its full height of about 12 feet, it produces this huge bloom. And it literally spits out all this pollen into the air. And it turns out that everyone on the island is incredibly allergic to this pollen. Not just on Salt Spring Island, but everywhere in the world where this black grass has grown. Everyone's allergic to it except my 3 heroes, Anaya, Petra, and Seth. And they're also immune to the other plants that start appearing on the planet shortly thereafter. The next thing that appears on the planet is a black vine. It grows very quickly up the sides of houses and grow into the houses, up walls, and it emits kind of a sleeping gas that puts people to sleep. It also produces these strange little pods that capture birds and squirrels and small animals and digest them with acid. They're kind of like pitcher plants or Venus flytraps, but most threatening of all are the plants that grow underground and wait for prey to walk overhead. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer, maybe a human, and they plunge through into these open pit plants. They're called. Plants seal up and digest their prey with an acidic enzyme. But again, My heroes, Anaya, Petra, and Seth, are immune to the sleeping gas that the vines produce and the acids that these terrible underground pit plants produce. There's a terrible scene that takes place on the school field of Anaya and Petra and Seth's school where the ground just opens up and pit plants start devouring students and teachers. And my three heroes escape unscathed, even though they fall inside these pit plants. And after that, the authorities start taking a very keen interest in my heroes because they're starting to wonder, what is special about these kids? And is there something about their bodies, their biochemistry, their immune system that we can use to make some kind of vaccine so people aren't allergic to the plants? So my three heroes are taken to a military research facility in Vancouver to a army base that's called Dead Man's Island. There truly is, I'm not making this up, there truly is an army base off Stanley Park in Vancouver called Dead Man's Island. And this is where the story now goes. At the army base, Petra and Anaya and Seth make some very startling discoveries, not only about where these cryptogenic plants have come from, but also about themselves. Because something else is happening to my characters, and they're not telling anyone. They're starting to change. Anaya is feeling better than she's ever felt before. Her allergic reactions have all but disappeared. She's feeling stronger. She has more stamina. But there are other changes that aren't so welcome. Anaya begins to notice that her fingernails, toenails are changing. They're getting thicker. They're getting pointier. And Petra begins to notice that she seems to be growing a tail. And Seth notices that he seems to be getting feathers coming from his arms. The kids are transforming and they don't know why, and they're terrified. I mean, imagine if this were happening to you. When I was writing the book, I kept having to pull back and remind myself how scary it would be if there's something happening to my body and I had no control over it. But that's what's happening to my characters in this book. One of the things the book addresses is change itself, changes to our planet, changes to our bodies, and some of these things obviously we have no control over. And any kind of change can be invigorating, but it can also be incredibly frightening. In Bloom, the planet is undergoing huge changes with all this new plant life that's erupting and spreading across its surface. We, on our planet Earth, are undergoing huge change too. But this change is caused by us as humans, climate change. This is something we can control. In my book, the changes are being imposed on us. No one knows quite by whom. But my characters are some of the only people on the planet who might be able to fight these changes. One of the many fascinating things I learned about plants doing research for the book is that plants are actually very vicious and aggressive. They can wage chemical warfare on each other under the soil by releasing certain chemicals. They're very invasive, they're territorial. And so the plants in my book, vicious as they are not really so far-fetched. They're just variations of things we have here on Earth, only they're a lot bigger and more successful at taking over. So I had this idea of a plant invasion for the first book, but I knew there were 2 more books to come. So it took me quite a while to figure out the full scope of the story. Usually when I write one book, I have a pretty good idea of the beginning, middle, and end before I start typing and working on chapter 1. In the case of the Bloom Trilogy, because I knew it was going to be such a big story, it took me a long time to figure out everything that was going to happen in the first book, the second book, and the third book, even though I had a basic idea of how each book would break down. And it was a bit like working on a jigsaw puzzle. Every time I wrote one book, I was adjusting the pieces of the second book and the third book. And then when I finished the first book, or thought I'd finished it and started the second book, I had to go back and change a little bit of the puzzle of the first book. So the second book worked well. And the same with the second and the third book. So it was kind of like writing 3 books every time I wrote one book, which was quite a challenge. So the first book took me the longest, just because I had so much to set up. It took me probably, I worked on Bloom probably a couple years. And then the second book took me, maybe a year. And the third book took me, a little under a year. So if you smush it all together, what does that get us? Maybe 4 years to write the 3 books? So that's how long the Bloom Trilogy took. When I started the first book, Bloom, Anaya was going to be the only character. It was really going to be her story. And it was sort of an ugly duckly story because she starts off the novel with all these allergies and food restrictions, acne, food sensitivities, and through the course of the book she becomes transformed. You know, she becomes really quite strong and much more confident in her abilities and her appearance. And as I wrote, I thought I needed some other kids in this story, and so I developed the characters of Petra and Seth. And it was interesting because every time I started writing this new character, I found them equally fascinating. So even though Anaya was the first character who came into my head, Petra and Seth became very familiar to me. And so in terms of who was my favorite character, I liked them all. But strangely, it was Seth who sort of was closest to my heart. He's the boy who's being fostered by the Antos family on the farm on Salt Spring Island. He's been moved around a lot. He has a lot stacked against him. And he has something he feels he wants to become, a place he wants to go, a state he wants to achieve. He wants to feel like he belongs, that he's loved, that he is where he was meant to be. And it's such a strong yearning in him. My heart just sort of went out to him. So I guess Seth is really my favorite character in the Bloom trilogy. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to my novel, Bloom. It's a book that starts with a huge rainfall and ends with a rainfall. And in the first book, this rainfall brings flora, plant life, cryptogenic plant life that takes over our entire planet. In book 2, which is called Hatch and is coming out this September, another rain occurs which introduces all this strange life, this fauna, if you will, onto our planet. And in the third book, called Thrive, which is coming out next year, you'll get to meet the creatures responsible for sending all this wonderful flora and fauna down on our planet. So that's Bloom, Hatch, and Thrive, making up the trilogy. I very much hope you enjoy it.